This is the first episode of the show, The Other Future, and I'm your host, Terry Tapp. Let me tell you a little bit about the show, what inspired it, and who we're going to be having on here. This show is inspired, actually, it was an idea after the 2016 election. A lot of people justifiably were in despair and felt very hopeless, as apparently they still do. And I was looking for reasons to feel hopeful, looking for actions and activities that were inspiring, that people could be involved with, that I could look to as maybe evidence of another future. And that's the inspiration for the show's title. My guess is that a lot of the despair and hopelessness that's going on is not only caused by what we're seeing in the media and the policies that are being pushed, not only nationally, but in many places internationally, but also by this idea that things could be different. The German philosopher Schelling had said that the opposite of existence is not non-existence, but insistence, a world that could be, but isn't. And I think that if you read enough, pay attention enough, you know that we could, with our technology, with our social skills, with our agriculture, we could produce a world of abundance. It's there at our fingertips. But we don't have this. And I believe that causes the majority of the attention today. So the other future is going to focus on looking at people in politics, in the arts, in sciences, in literature, that are actually doing something to bring about that other world. I know at different times, especially in the 20th century, we had social experiments like the Russian Revolution, experiments in the 60s in the U.S. that actually began to work and were taken down by market forces, by international pressures from big business and so forth. So today, my first guest is Douglas Lain. I met Lain through his podcast about 9 years ago called Diet Soap. Diet Soap was an exploration of philosophy, but also an exploration of art, of ideas that I hadn't seen online. Most of what I had seen online was a lot less in depth and a lot less willing to take risks than Doug Lain was. So, also he's moved on from Diet Soap to being the publisher of Zero Books. Zero Books reminds me of Semiotext, which is a title that goes across genres, kind of with a heretical mixing of themes and lines of inquiry. And I really am impressed by that. So I wanted to have Doug Lain on first to kind of set the tone for the shows to come because of his willingness to cross those lines and to ask some very difficult and fun questions, actually. So, Doug, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Hey, welcome to The Other Future.
Hey, glad to be on.
You just heard the introduction where I was talking about my meeting you, so to speak, at least through the internet. And can you say a little bit more about what inspired Diet Soap?
Yeah. Well, let's see. The original Diet Soap was a zine that I created in, I think it was 1993. So at that time, what inspired Diet Soap was my own ambition to be a literary giant and to write interesting works and get all my friends to come together and write essays. It was an anarchist zine,
right?
But it also had sort of a satirical edge to it. Remember the first, at least one of the first issues of Diet Soap was on the subject of UFOs. So,
right.
It was not exactly a serious zine. But then later on, after I published some short fiction and had a collection come out and was sort of working more seriously on my writing career, I started it again with M.K. Hobson, who's a novelist and a good friend of mine, and she and I created Diet Soap as more of a journal, and published some pretty good fiction and some interesting essays as well in about 4 issues of Diet Soap. And in order to promote that zine, I started a podcast. I was listening to podcasts on a little iPod mini as I would go to work for Comcast every morning. And I thought, hey, it sounds like anyone can do these. So I listened to a podcast called The Sea Realm with a guy named KMO, and he did a very professional style radio show, I thought. It was a podcast, of course, and but I realized after listening to about 5 episodes that it was just him, that he wasn't a professional at all, and I figured if he could do it and interview academics and experts and artists of all types from like the cab of his truck,
right?
That I could probably do it as well. So I started doing Diet Soap, the podcast, to promote the zine, and then also because the economic crisis had happened.
Yeah, I was going to say that's. If we could stop there for a second, I'm aware of KMO, and I really I've enjoyed his podcast for years, and the trajectory of his thought or his explorations, because he began like me. He's from the South, and he also studied neuroscience or cognitive science. He was very interested in that, and then he. His podcast was kind of from a libertarian, even almost abstractly philosophical point of view, and then went into this kind of doomsday prepper period, and then emerged into a lot of economic exploration, and that's where I began to meet you through Diet Soap. With that economic exploration. So the crisis is what I'm hearing, that time period is what inspired that?
Yeah, right.
Okay.
Around 2008, 2009 is when I started my first podcast, the Diet Soap, and it was inspired by having heard KMO and because of the economic crisis. But, we've been a decade of crisis already.
Right.
I mean, it was a different form. So, in a way that it started with the crisis of the anti-WTO movement. In other words, from my perspective, the failure of the anti-globalization, anti-WTO battle for Seattle movement in 1999 when I was 28 was a kind of crisis, because I saw it come up and really felt like it was my own politics put into action.
I felt the same.
Inspired by the anti-globalization movement. And then when it fell apart, and then after 9/11, particularly, there was a feeling of crisis and oppression that I really had not experienced before. The Bush administration, the Bush years, were frightening, really. I felt that, I was probably more paranoid than I needed to be, but I felt that, our civil liberties were being taken away, not just opportunistically, but as a response to a growing movement. I mean, obviously, the excuse was 9/11, but, I was involved in the anti-war movement, and when we invaded Iraq, when the U.S. invaded Iraq, to see the police on the streets in force, the way that they were right after the invasion, and to again see a massive popular uprising against the war. I mean, I had people contacting me who had never been to a protest, wanting to know how they could get involved in the peace movement. There were tens of thousands on the streets before the invasion, and then right after there was in Portland anyway, a very big response. A lot of people wanted to protest, but the police were out in massive numbers as well, and the peace movement itself just felt like it basically was shuttered. It shut itself down.
I think we both had that kind of crisis. I was not in Seattle in '99, but the next protest in April 2000, I took my democratically delivered tear gassing and beating in Washington, protesting the World Bank. And, I too, I felt that futility, because to get out and just allow yourself to be attacked physically by the police is not really productive. Not that I'm against protesting at all, but I didn't see where that was going to go, and it really felt disheartening, especially, as you said, once you get to the financial collapse of 2008. That was disastrous for a lot of people.
Yeah. What was different about 2008 was it was not just a crisis for people who wanted to change the system, but realizing that the system itself was in crisis. And in other words, I kind of thought that the capitalist system, was a system of oppression and inequality, and that it was doing fine,
right,
by its own on its own terms. And then the 2008 crisis came along, and I realized that the symptoms of capitalism that I had been experiencing really since I left home and struck out on my own, the precarity and low wages and the inequality and all of that, that wasn't really the intention of the capitalist system. It was just a constant unintended consequence of the capitalist system, and that it could get worse than what I had experienced. Right. I certainly by no means really lived through abject poverty.
Yeah, let me interrupt you there for just a second, because I do think you and I, we're about the same age, and we've had, we're in this. I don't like to use these.
You're a touch older than I am, aren't you? You're near mid-50s or something.
I just turned 52 last month.
Okay, so yeah. I'm 4 years younger.
Okay.
I want to hold on to that. It's important to me.
Yeah, it is. It separates things well. But we're in this, I don't like to use these terms, but Generation X, to put that into some sort of cultural stereotype. And, we've experienced the Reagan years. We experienced the Bush years and what was going on there, first Bush the first. And we also experienced the utopia that came with the birth of the public internet in the early 1990s. And that was actually, as people were looking back, a utopian moment in this country. And felt very hopeful. I'd never felt that kind of hope when I saw people, artists communicating, activists, people involved. There was a volunteer fireman in a city I was living in who had a board up when those BBSs about artificial intelligence, artificial life, all types of files you could download at a very slow speed on a squawky modem. That's wonderful. And I thought that things were really going to change. So it was disheartening to see a far-right candidate like Clinton get in the office and take us in that direction, and then, as you said, the Bush years. And each step seems to be further and further pushing us toward, a concentration of wealth, complete dissolution of civil liberties, and things like this. When I found Diet Soap, what I liked about that was two things. You still seem to have the air of that optimism, because you're willing to talk about psychedelics, you're willing to talk about art, you're willing to talk about abstract issues in philosophy, and yet at the same time to ask these questions, hard questions, not only about economics and politics, but about what we can actually do about it. And that, at the moment in 2010 when I found you online, that was very different. What I was hearing was largely not even abstract, but people like recordings of professors, if you wanted to go in that direction, or people not understanding on the ground politics or political theory of any sort. And I was refreshed by it. You mentioned on your podcast you'd seen this real upswing in interest in Marx after 2008.
Yeah.
Can you say something about that?
Yeah, well, I was part of it. I mean, I was not a Marxist before 2008. And I became interested in Marx because what was until then had been a kind of an anarchist politics that defined my leftism.
Right.
I was a fan of Chomsky, but also of the Situationists International and a variety of other characters on the left. But I had not really studied capitalism itself. But the economic crisis made me realize, again, that I needed to understand what the system itself was a little more thoroughly. and I interviewed a bunch of different economists, including anarchist economists, starting around 2009,
Right.
alongside other people. And as I went along, I became more and more interested in what's known as critical theory.
Right. From the Frankfurt School.
I had a philosophy degree from from college days, and I had sort of abandoned philosophy for probably almost a decade, and then the economic crisis and interviewing different economists sort of pushed me back towards philosophy, but towards critical theory, the Frankfurt School, and even today's version of left theory.
Right.
And it brought me slowly and surely through like being interested in people like Slavoj Žižek back to Karl Marx. And I'm still not done reading. I should be a better Marxist than I am. I haven't read volumes 2 or 3 yet, but I need to keep reading and trying to understand Marxist theory and his critique of capitalism.
Right.
It became important to me, but I'm not sure if I'm like a passé now. I think more than a decade after the economic crisis, that imperative to look at the system itself as a kind of mechanism, as a real system,
Right.
May have faded away again. I think it certainly since 2016, the focus has shifted.
On to
We
what?
can get to that.
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, onto electoral politics and onto Trump, and onto the state as well, I suppose, but not even most of the time, not even in a very political or rigorous analysis of the state as an institution, but more about the party players and about personalities. And a fear has arisen, I think, rightly, of populist reaction.
Yes.
As well.
I see a lot of that. I don't really want to discuss Trump, but I see him as a diversion.
I don't either. I'm tired of that.
Yeah. Yeah, it's looking at the disease long enough. But it's a diversion. As you said, there was this interest, and I don't see it waning so much just from my perusal of podcasts and writings online. But I do see the sleight of hand as it's moved toward, focusing on this foolishness that's going on in the media spectacle. But I'm interested. One thing I'm glad to have you on as the first episode because I really enjoy reading Marx. Sometimes he's hard to read, but
right.
I do enjoy Marxist theory. But as I was telling a gentleman a couple of weeks ago, I said, it's interesting to me that I enjoy reading William James. I enjoy reading Simone de Beauvoir. I enjoy reading Bertrand Russell. And if you say that you're reading William James, Bertrand Russell, Simone de Beauvoir, you don't get the same response as if you say I'm reading Marx. Immediately you're demonized. People want to put a hazmat suit on, at least ideologically. And that's intriguing to me, that after all this time, simply saying that you're reading someone's work inspires that sort of reaction, especially from Dummyland, from the senators and House of Representatives who come from a legal background and haven't read any sort of theory of any kind.
I guess it depends on who you're talking, what your milieu is. I mean, on the left, because since I started working for Zero Books, because the podcast I did called Diet Soap led to me getting a gig working for a left wing theory imprint called Zero Books, and since I started working for them, I talked to more academics and also more leftists, professional leftists maybe or journalists.
Right.
And if you say you're reading Marx, to that crowd, the response is it's almost. I worked for the Oregon Symphony for a while,
right?
And if you were asked by someone who worked in the Oregon Symphony, in the upper level, administrative level, who your favorite musician was, or what kind of music you were listening to, if you said something like, "Well, I'm listening to Bach," or "I'm listening to Beethoven," they would look at you like you were kind of an outsider.
Right.
Not because they didn't like Beethoven or Bach, but it was just so basic, right? You know, you should be, and actually the dirty secret was, you know, if you asked them, they would say, well, you know, I like, I don't know, some sort of country music, or
Right.
you know, I'm interested in jazz, anything but this classical that we're surrounded with all the time.
Right.
So I think that on the left, there's sort of a weird embrace and aversion to Marx himself as well. It's different. It's like, yeah, I'm not reading Marx. I'm reading whoever's out from Verso right now, or I'm reading you know, a Marxist who's 3 steps away from Marx.
Right.
You know,
I do note that, and going on to Zero Books now, because that's where you headed from Diet Soap, as you said. What do you see as trends going on with that? Because you probably heard, I began the program saying that one thing I like about Zero Books is that they are willing to cross boundaries, like semiotext. I don't know, we've never discussed that, but the background, you know, semiotext, I still buy their editions all the time as they come out. Their founder, Sylvain Lotringer, he's in his 90s now, but still was an amazing person, was an amazing editor when he was doing that actively. And I like that about Zero Books, because it's hard to find people that will step out of those boundaries. It's even hard to find people like yourself with whom I can discuss Marx's writings who aren't doctrinaire Marxist or, you know, doctrinaire anti-Marxist. I mean, we can discuss it like we would any other form of theory. And if you say more about that, what are you seeing as trends coming through Zero Books?
Well, I hate this because I'm sort of at the helm of Zero Books.
Sure.
I don't know if what I'm seeing is a trend or not. It's more like, what am I doing? But
well, that's fine.
I would say that overall the trend has been, well, when I started at Zero Books, there was a lot of interest in something called object-oriented ontology.
Right.
And I would put it this way, that when I started at Zero Books, there was a lot of interest in doing media studies work,
right,
and work around sort of abstract philosophical issues, which are worthwhile, and that since 2016, and also since I've been sort of pushing for it, there has been more of an interest in politics and analyzing the current moment,
right,
and less it hasn't totally gone away, but less interest in sort of the post-structuralist left that was sort of that even though everyone was trying to move away from it, was still dominating the academic left, as far as I could tell, say 4 or 5 years ago. That like there are people like Deleuze who are still very popular and were very popular 4 or 5 years ago, who's a French theorist that came after 68, and the failure kind of was a philosopher that explained and sort of reacted to the failure of 1968
right,
in Paris. But he's not always thought of in those terms, but that's how I think of him. But so now, I think we're still reeling. The thing that we're not talking about, or that we should mention, is the Occupy Wall Street movement, because I would say that was the last time there was a major movement on the left that was anti-capitalist directly, and that
directly related to people's lives.
Yeah, it was directly related to people's lives, but it was more than just because, look, Black Lives Matter, which is a fine movement, is directly related to people's lives. Right? The environmental movement is directly related to people's lives.
Right.
Jobs for Justice, the living wage movement is directly related to people's lives. Occupy Wall Street was about saying we want to change the system that's setting up the terms of our life. We want to go to the background of our life and get a hold of some of the institutional, political, and economic assumptions that constrain our lives.
Yeah, I think one thing that ties all that together into Occupy Wall Street is whether you're looking at the Me Too movement or you're looking at Black Lives Matter, ultimately, or you're looking at any sort of ecological crisis or the movement dealing with that, ultimately they tie into a system that extracts profit and resources and immiserates people. And that's Wall Street. I mean, Wall Street's at least the head of that tumor.
Right. And the difference is when you are trying to deal with the symptoms of that system, and one way or another, which you have to do. I mean, you can't not address those things.
Correct.
Or when you have the ambition and the organization and maybe even the pressure of the moment to try to move beyond treating symptoms and getting to the foundation of the problem. And I would say that the Occupy Wall Street movement, as much as it missed the mark in terms of setting achievable goals in the moment and being able to hold on as a quasi-institution or stay organized with the same ambition for a long time, as much as the occupation of the parks as a tactic kind of also limited what they could be done in the future, like how future-oriented they could be really. It nonetheless was a moment where there was true ambition for systemic change, for foundational radical change. And
WIOX is supported by The Great American, a full-range supermarket in Prattsville, family-owned and operated for more than 10 years. Great American, located on Main Street in Prattsville Plaza, open Monday through Saturday, 8 a.m. to 9 p.m., Sunday, 8 a.m. to 7 p.m. WIOX is supported by the Mountain Eagle Weekly newspaper, serving Schoharie, Delaware, and Greene counties with local news, politics, sports, cultural events, information, and business services. Available at stores in Stamford, Bloomville, Hobart, Davenport, by subscription, and online at themountaineagle.com, THE-mountaineagle.com.
As you can be, like as much reform as you can do.
Hey, Doug, let me pause you for a second there.
Sure.
So what do you see? Like, there are two things that you brought up that I'd like to discuss to segue into these important issues. One is you were talking about how Zero Books, the titles were much more theoretical. Media studies and, studies of post 1968 post-leftist ideology and so forth, and very academic in a way. Mm-hmm. I'm noticing, not only in the outer world, but in my own head lately, it's more and more difficult to think about abstract issues. And I'm wondering if that's because of the pressing crises of the day, climate change, the extreme concentration of wealth that's going on. What do you think? I mean, you could just respond to that. Do you feel that? Do you feel that's pushing Zero Books titles, the inquiry that's going on? How do you feel about that personally?
Well, I feel like I'm kind of a complicated or contradictory response to that. Well, the first thing I would say is that when I was describing the kinds of works we would get when I first started at the imprint, some of them I really liked, but overall, the focus on media and communication and ideology was abstract, but it was also, I think, a bit misdirected. I would say that we can't stop worrying about really abstract issues, but we had come up with a direction maybe after 68 where what we were focusing on was how we communicated.
Right.
What kinds of words we use, whether or not a sentence could have a fixed meaning, where the ideas in our heads came from. We terms would be deployed like the political imaginary.
Right.
Things like that, right? So it was all about ideology, the kinds of ideas we have, the kinds of ways we imagine that we are people.
And this is taking us into post-structuralism, deconstruction, various waves of feminist thought into the 70s progressed.
Yeah. And so the materialist approach, or the approach of, a Marxist would be to say, well, in order to understand any of that thoroughly and in radical or real terms, you have to look at how people are actually working together to create their lives. In other words, we have to eat,
right,
and how we determine together to solve that problem, how we organize our lives so that we can distribute food and shelter and clothes and all sorts of other material goods, is going to determine these things like what is the political imaginary, or what kinds of people are we, or what does a sentence mean? All those kinds of questions are going to be really not directly caused by, but set up within a context by the material relations that we that we go through, that we rely on, that we think of as being almost natural.
Right.
And so the Marxist or materialist critique would be to say, I'm not that interested in the political imaginary, or I'm not interested in that first. What I'm more interested in is what's real despite the political imaginary.
Right.
And
well, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Well, I was
so. What I was going to say, today there's two things going on. On the one hand, we're more and more likely to try to have that materialist approach.
Yes.
But the only way that it's expressed in action, in real terms in our lives, in ways that seem immediate, is through these social democratic movements to elect people like Sanders, who I'm not against, but who don't go all the way to a Marxist critique, and which keep us from actually making that thoroughgoing, even materialist critique, so that we can't give up abstraction or theory, but and as we move towards action, we have to try to keep both things going. But when we've gone into the realm of theory by itself, as if all that matters is what we think, then we're off on the wrong track.
Yeah, that used to, back in the 90s, when it was less of an active political question to look into, or have these theoretical discussions. It bored me to talk. I identified as an anarchist then, and it bored me to talk to people about these intricacies of anarcho-syndicalist theory or something that was really silly.
Yeah.
I'd rather discuss something about ontology, something conceptual that didn't actually refer to things people actually did on planet Earth at one time.
Right.
Actual political things.
Yeah. How many times have you had the debate about whether or not it should be a majority rule vote, or whether you had to have a thoroughgoing, absolute consensus process?
And it really doesn't matter at all in any way at that time. But what do you see right now, whether you have a practical discussion, a theoretical discussion, or some hopefully mixed discussion of ways of progressing in the world collectively, what do you see in terms of how that's translating right now to electoral politics? And this is my perception. This isn't really anything theoretical by any means. But just my perception is we have these ideas, we have these hopes, and yet what we get is Sanders, who I like. He's far too centrist for me, as you're alluding to.
Yeah.
And people like Ocasio-Cortez and Ilhan Omar, well, they're very hopeful, but if you look at the candidates even, they're a tiny segment in a lot of upcoming corporate Democrats and people desperately conspiring, really, to maintain the status quo of capitalism, of Wall Street, and of the resource extraction psychologically, spiritually, and physically that's been going on in the country. That seems really sad that this theoretical work, and any type of political aim can translate to this tiny hope for one more seat in the House of Representatives. What do you feel about that? And let me add one other thing, too. I've noticed whenever there is something positively voted on, like an expansion of Medicaid or legalization of pot, so we don't expend all that time, money, and energy on the drug war, the state legislatures will override that. Even in North Carolina, where they at one time they were pushing for a Democratic governor. I know all the troubles there now, or Virginia, but the state will pull back the gubernatorial powers so that the legislature, so that whatever progress you've finally made, and maybe it's incremental and tiny, it will be extracted too. What's your take on that? I mean, that feels very hopeless.
Right. Well, okay. So let me see how I can start to crack this. Well, one of the things that's positive about this moment, my cats are wrestling in the other room.
That's fine.
One of the things that's positive about this moment is that because of the rise of Trump and because of the dangers of being apolitical, there's a realization that there's a need to be outright political to seek power. I'm not sure. I mean, it's actually debated in Zero Books as to whether or not we're living through a massively political moment or whether or not we're actually living through a massively anti-politics moment.
Yes.
And I think that there's a good portion of just regular working class people who are sick of all politics, and I don't blame them.
All.
Yeah, right. But for those who might have been more keen on doing discourse analysis or something a few years ago, there's now a feeling like, oh, yeah, no, we need to seek power. This old idea that we could just build movements that would affect the culture and do constant propaganda without ever seeking power was a mistake.
Yeah.
But the question is still, like, to what end? And to me, like really old Marxist debates around, like, what is the dictatorship of the proletariat? Whether, or something like, was the Soviet Union actually socialist? Those are important, again, if you are actually seeking power. And so I would say that in this moment, one of the things we can do is try to reconceive of the past and try to also understand what it would mean to be a revolutionary in political terms today.
That's a really important point you made, because this is something I've thought about a lot, and I believe you and I talked about it one time, but I think it's an underlying current through almost everything I'm seeing today. And that is everything I'm seeing in terms of political or social writing. And that is that we don't know where to go. You and I were at a talk that was given by Richard Wolff, the economist, who I like quite a bit. And he was on a panel, and he said, you can't do anything without a party, without an organization. And you don't want to hear it, but you can't. And recently, I was watching a documentary called American Reds about what the Communist Party in the U.S. did in the 30s. And it's stunning. They almost all of the push for any sort of progressive legislation came from them. There was even an incident, and I need to brush up on the specifics of it, but basically a group of young men, young African-American men, was charged in Alabama with thinking prurient thoughts about a white woman or something like this. And they were going to execute them. And the Communist Party intervened in that. The Communist Party meaning the people of the United States who were members of this party, not Stalin, not any of these monsters out there, but those people who believed in economic democracy and social democracy went and actually were able to put enough pressure on the state government of Alabama to stop that execution and release those young men. That's unheard of, and they were the only people to do that. So looking at that kind of power at that time is, to me, as a guy, a middle-aged guy here in 2019, remarkable. But they also had this idea of where they were headed. They had an imaginative goal of a future.
Right.
And that's what I'm seeing as a complete lack right now. Any sort of understanding of what would be the point of forming a party, of pushing for policies. You don't just want better wages, and you don't just want some buttressing against catastrophic climate change, though that would be welcome, as would better wages. But these are paltry Band-Aids to a greater, even spiritual problem, I think. I mean, at its root, about our age, spiritual and material. I don't see how ultimately to separate those two. But what do you think of that?
Well, I think that, I think that one of the things that we have to be willing to do as we try to become a party that's political if we were trying to form a left political party, we would have two really difficult tasks ahead of us. One would be to resist just becoming another version of the social democratic movement that we already see in the world. In other words, resist the idea that we should create a laundry list of reforms of the system as it is and have that be the primary platform. So there would be that issue. The other would be to be able to work together in a party to come up with political aims that would be probably sometimes reformist or at least immediate, so that, for instance, maybe we would be working on helping communities, workers, gain control over their own circumstances through city councils or the state legislature,
right.
To restrict the ways that the kind of oppression and exploitation they would be faced and to empower their own organizations within the workplace. Maybe we would be working on something immediate, like setting up workers' councils. And my son is talking about this. He's a member of the YDS, and he wants to have more of an influence on his own university and also on the city he's in, which is Eugene. So, he has this idea of creating new political institutions, new workers' councils that would seek to have directly proletariat or working class political influence over already existing institutions. But the point is that we would be seeking to have those kinds of goals, but while we are doing it, we have to have conversations about things like, can we separate the need for a spiritual meaning in our lives and our political ambitions for a better world? And I would say that some of the questions that people turn to spirituality in order to solve are actually not going to be thoroughly solved by a working class revolution. That one of the things that might be holding back our political struggles is the fact that if we were to be free of the constraints of the current economic system and political system, we would be even more constrained by these deeper issues of what it is to be human.
Yes.
And that we would be confronted with sort of spiritual malaise after that. That freedom it doesn't come without a cost.
I think that's the root. To me, I would love to be burdened with that. As I've wondered at different times, yeah. I mean, we already have that, if you want to call it an existential burden to carry at the same time, and all its complicated offshoots. But I was thinking I think this often, as an artist, as a painter, as a drawer, comic artist, so much of the time I'm influenced by what's going on externally. Looking at people struggling for the rent, looking at people dealing with flooding, looking at people feeling hopeless about changing the actual conditions of their lives, which depress them, which oppress them, if you want to use those words. If you pulled all those away, there's an underlying human struggle, an individual struggle, that we aren't really even getting to because of the overwhelming nature of these daily crises. And that's a real shame, because I think that's the root of art at that point. You know, there was an exhibit, it may have been online, and I've actually forgotten where I saw this, but an exhibit in which they asked artists to paint, draw, and sculpt, film, photograph, whatever you're going to do, but it's all visual artists, subjects that they would paint, draw, sculpt, and so forth if there was peace. Peace meaning this giant amorphous idea of peace, that they're not struggling for food.
No, I get it, yeah.
Yeah.
And what would you do? What would you draw?
I'm still, I'm still struggling with that, because I'm overwhelmed by, my own background. And let me tell you, this is a social media type of observation, but on social media, I've lived in New York City for a decade almost. Right now, I'm splitting my time between the Catskills and New York City. I'm physically living in the Catskills. On social media, I still have a lot of people from my old stomping grounds of West Virginia, Kentucky, Tennessee, and people in Hong Kong and Paris and New York City and L.A. and so forth. So on the one hand, with these artists and philosophers, intellectuals in these other places other than that, Upper South area, these people are going to exhibits, they're traveling, they're living lives that seem actually pretty fun. And next to the updates of their status on social media, I'll see people saying, I was struggling, I didn't have enough money for food, I got this job as a welder at this plant they're building, and now they're not going to pay me. Does anyone know what I can do? People are going,
right.
We had medical bills. It's a nightmare. And when I look at that, I think, when I see someone who's a painter in New York City and he's, made a painting that's like 3 red lines slopped onto a canvas, and then I see someone's life who, their father is dead from an opioid addiction and they're unable to pay rent and so forth. The contrast is overwhelming. And I don't know if I could remove all of the one, would I just paint 3, lackadaisical stripes of red paint on a canvas? I don't think so. But that's a question I want to find the answer to, because I'd like to have, for many people, that possibility that you would actually have to worry about the lack of external stresses.
Right. Yeah, well, there's a sort of right-wing view that if we took away the striving from the world, if everyone was operating on the level of, let's say, a comfortable middle-class person who never had to worry about where their next paycheck was coming from or how to get, clean water or weren't going to be concerned if they had a medical issue that they would just end up out on the streets. If we took all that away, then we'd lead these decadent, ultimately boring lives.
Right,
that it's really the poor who are vigorously alive as they struggle. This is sort of a right-wing idea.
Yeah.
Right? I would say that I would actually say that the people who are struggling for issues around survival today don't do that on their and it's something separate from their questing after meaning.
Right.
Like, these things are intimately connected.
Oh, I totally agree.
Are we almost at the end of the hour already?
We actually are. It flies by
I'm
fast.
feeling like I just got started. I cleared my throat. And
I know. There are so many things I want to talk about on this. One thing I want to do on this program, if I have someone on and we talk, like I've got people lined up for talking about prison abolition, for instance, that 1 hour is not the only hour we can talk. I can bring people on again. There's so much going on right now. I mean, it's as much as the times are seemingly apocalyptic. They're filled with ideas and they're filled with possible actions. many of which you can undertake to change things. And I was reading about when we were discussing net neutrality, for instance. This is on my list. People building community-based internet, and it's not regulated. They're bouncing, amplifying signals off rooftops, rooftop dishes and things. There are possibilities of changing your life immediately in a way that gets away from these continuing forces, emanating at least from the image of Wall Street, the spectacle of Wall Street. And as you're talking about these spiritual issues, there's so much we can discuss on that. I mean, ultimately, we're all going to suffer since we're mortal and we're trapped, in a consciousness, which is a very interesting approach or line of inquiry to making art, to making music, to philosophizing, to reflecting on that condition. But having to pay rent is just like a really big impediment to that kind of reflection. So,
I would, if I could dream up a future that would be kind of like, let's say, a post-scarcity future where people weren't going to have to struggle for paychecks, and that their primary issue would be what is going to bring meaning to their lives. How are they going to make their life matter to themselves, to their loved ones, and to some sort of larger than life concept, whether it's God or history or humanity.
Right.
What I would say that would be first and foremost on my mind is, are we going to turn back to outer space? Are we going to be able to become explorers again of the infinite reaches above us without having, a deadly Cold War conflict in the background pushing us along? Can we organize ourselves to try to reach out into the universe for its own sake?
Right.
And that would be where I would want to go next. If the revolution happened tomorrow.
Well, there is that push. Like this is something I see in the background of these utopian moments. It wasn't that when people talk about utopias and they look at like New Harmony, Indiana, or some of these settlements that the bloody settler colonialists after that first wave of murderers set up these peaceful places like socialist utopias at that time. They were thought of as. We look at them as throwbacks, as nostalgic in essence, and they were very progressive at the time. They thought of the emerging science of the day, and even as you were saying, space. If you look at Russian cosmism and things, they looked at these wild dreams. The early '60s, late '50s in the United States, you can find people who were really beginning to think what we would think of as crazy thoughts and make plans for immortality, space travel. There was a whole push that I'm too young to have been part of, but there was a whole push toward these insane lunatic visions. And I miss it.
The Bohemian scene, you could still find this like remnants of these kind of lunatic visions, in books and conversation, and it's sort of always been the background of the flip side of left politics is this sort of utopian madness, which it has to always have this sort of component of madness to it, which I think is okay.
And we don't have that at all today. I mean, if you look at our politics right now, there's no one saying anything that's truly insane. And this is one of the things, not to bring it back to any particular person, but if you look at Barack Obama's compromises, he would immediately give his opponents what they wanted and then back up from that. There needs to be an insane push, policies that are ludicrous, lunatic, that push us off the board, so that when we're pulled back... We at Zero Books are at times we're willing to be insane. Yeah.
I interviewed Aubrey de Grey, who is a longevity researcher who would like to create, a future where the average lifespan is indefinite, but, 1,000 years isn't outside the range of sort of the regular, everyday, ordinary folks.
That would really change your marriage.
It would change so much.
I'm saying that as a joke, but well, a friend of mine who's very hopeful. She's an activist.
But it's not a joke because it would change marriage. Imagine being married to the same person for 1,000 years. Yeah. I don't know. I mean, I've been married for 24, and 1,000 sounds like a lot longer than that.
Yes.
Anyway, go ahead.
No, it would change. There's a friend of mine. She's an activist in Canada, and I saw where she said, basically, you people, if you're able to build a really progressive, wonderful future, as she called it, a communist future, we're able to mitigate climate change through action and through technology. She said, I see this actually happening. She said, and we'll be bored and we'll be screaming at each other, and it'll be all your fault. So we're
screaming at each other now, and we're all bored anyway. So.
But no, we do need to return to these lunatic visions so that we can have some pushback to a spot into the future. Right now, what we have is, these very small centrist type reforms that we're really fighting hard for, and fighting hard against people who are publicly, at least, claiming to be for them as well, while privately working against them.